Who spent many years in Havana is Dr. Helen Yaffe, an expert on Cuba, a fellow in economic history from the London School of Economics. Dr. Yaffe, thank you very much for your time. I see you've written a book called Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution. We'll come to the economics in a minute, but when you say Che Guevara and you think Fidel Castro, you think two men in their military fatigues, their green caps, their beards, their cigars, great friends. Did one radicalize the other? How did the relationship work? They were, of course, the leaders of the '59 revolution along with Raúl.
Yeah. Well, when Che Guevara met Fidel Castro in Mexico, Fidel had already carried out the first sort of insurrectionary attack on the Moncada barracks, the Batista dictatorship. So he was already committed to a revolutionary course for changing the regime in Cuba. An armed uprising, and Che Guevara had been travelling around Latin America, and his ideas had radicalised, and he had concluded that United States imperialism and monopolies and the landed oligarchy and so on were the main ills for Latin America, and that he was committed to liberating the people of Latin America. So really it was, to use probably a not appropriate term, a match made in heaven. Che was looking for a way to be able to channel those views that he had, and Fidel Castro was already engaged in the revolutionary struggle.
A serendipitous meeting.
Indeed.
Of two minds that think alike. So did Che see something in the situation in Cuba that would encourage his form of revolution that they brought together? What was happening in Cuba in the 1950s that led to this situation where a guerrilla army would even bother to form to fight against the president?
Well, you had Batista in power. He'd carried out a coup with support from the United States in 1952. And Batista had actually been the president of Cuba and been in charge of Cuba essentially for many years in a previous period. But this time he was even more brutal. The dictatorship left some 20,000 Cubans dead, often corpses turned up at the side of the road in horrific conditions we won't go into. So one of the things, if you read Che Guevara's book, his sort of guidebook to guerrilla struggle, guerrilla warfare, one of the things he says is, armed struggle should be undertaken when all the democratic channels have been exhausted, and that was certainly the case as far as they were concerned in Cuba. Fidel Castro himself had been a candidate in the elections, which were ultimately got rid of by the coup that Batista carried out. So for Fidel Castro, he had tried the democratic or electoral road to changing the system in Cuba, and that had failed because of the dictatorship, which they were very conscious was supported by the United States.
And you say democratic channels, and yet then, after they win this victory in 1959, they enter Havana, they establish, or Fidel does, the first one-party communist state in the Western Hemisphere. That's not democratic.
Well, it's certainly true that they didn't have elections in Cuba until 1976, but they did introduce a new constitution and new elections, but not the kind of elections that we recognise when we come from a party political system. And part of the problem of perception, and part of why you can hear, I'm sure you're interviewing people who have completely different perspectives, is this question of, what do we define as democracy? So in Cuba, elections take place, but people don't stand as members of parties. They stand either as representatives of local communities, or their workplace, or social or cultural societies and institutions, and they're represented in Parliament. So, for example, you have 8 seats in Parliament put aside for university students. Now, for those people who regard what we've just seen in the United States as the model of democracy, of course we find that missing in Cuba, and then therefore we would conclude that democracy is missing in Cuba. But they have a different system, and I think that the failure of people to really understand what's going on in Cuba is because they failed to make this imminent critique, where they are trying to understand what are the actual challenges that Cuba has faced, but what has been their strategic objective. You know, Fidel Castro laid out a program in the Moncada program. He said, we want to bring housing, healthcare, education, and so on for our people. And on the whole, what has happened under the revolution has been consistent with the pursuance of those strategic objectives. Now, for some people, that is what freedom is. And democracy is. It is access to healthcare and education. For others, it's not. For others, it's the freedom to have a small business, of political associations, and establish yourself, and so on. So this is why we have such a contradictory reflection on Fidel's legacy, Fidel's contribution, or, you know, whether he was destructive or, in fact, you know, a gift to humanity and so on. And that's why there's also equally divergent views on the Cuban Revolution and what it's achieved.
Okay, that's extremely interesting. And I want to bring it down to one of the most simplest things you can imagine. The ability to meet friends and be together. Is it a myth that if there are 3 or 4 people together on the street corner talking, somebody from the authorities will come up and say, look, be careful, guys, what are you doing?
Yeah, not only is it a myth, I mean, you know, I have to struggle not to laugh.
People say this, though.
They may say all sorts of things. I've heard that Cubans lock children up in cages and, you know, I mean, it's absurd. The reality is that if you go to Cuba, and increasingly people from the United States are going to Cuba, and they're seeing that what they have built up in their heads, this sort of impression that they have, is so far from the truth. The Cuban people are world leaders in music, in culture, in art and sport. Now, you could not achieve what they have achieved in those fields if you had this kind of dictatorship where everyone was vigilating everyone, where you couldn't, you know, get together and express yourselves. I mean, you know, without expression, there is no art, is there? So I think that, you know, we have to not only, you know, not take these myths for their word, but also try and understand where they come from and why, and whose purposes they serve. If you do that, you dehumanize Cubans. The Cuban people are a revolutionary population. They fought against the Spanish. They had the 10-Year War. They had an independence movement. They had a revolution in 1933. You know, if they had really been oppressed to the level that we're expected to believe, you know, they also know where the guns are. They're all militarily trained. You know, you're not helping yourself to explain what really happens in Cuba if you take those kind of simplistic notions, which are ideologically charged.
It helps us so much that you've been to Cuba to see things for yourself, Dr. Helen Yaffe. Thank you very much indeed. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.